Well, hello, Park Plaza Church of Christ. It's good to be with you all again. I'm greatly encouraged by your desire to learn, as well as your heart for ministry. And reports about both go out in other parts of Oklahoma about what happens here locally, so I think that's great. And on another note, can I just stay here until this whole storm blows over? You know, 'cause I was driving through sheets of white, and it was something else. So if that's okay with you, I'll make it worth your while. I'll talk for a little bit, and then we'll see if this is all passed by the time we're done. I've been tasked with this topic of the return from exile of the people of Judah in particular, although on a more broad scale, we call them Israel. But as you've studied in past weeks, I know that there was a split between Israel after the reign of King Solomon we hear about in the biblical record, and then we had a northern kingdom, which retained that name Israel, and then you had the southern kingdom of Judah ruled by the Davidic kings. And then 722 BC, that northern kingdom was exiled to regions beyond Syria, beyond Mesopotamia altogether, for that matter, and more or less fizzled out as an entity. And yet, the kingdom of Judah remained until their own exile, when they lost their current Davidic king, Zedekiah, and they lost their homeland, and most importantly, they lost their central sanctuary of Yahweh, the temple in Jerusalem. A catastrophic event for these people, and one that's quite remarkable in terms of the way that this reinvented the nation and their religion as well. If you think about works that come to us from the ancient world, whether it be monuments, great works of literature, or inspiring feats of politics, you don't tend to think of Israel fulfilling any of those categories. If you want monuments, you go to a place like Egypt and you look at those great testimonies to what the pharaohs envisioned and their builders. If you want great literature, you look to the high literary style of those classic Greek poets like Homer, Hesiod. And if you want very impressive politics, if you want to talk about people who pulled together not only their own nation, but any number of other subject peoples, you're talking about Rome, perhaps, or Persia. And so Israel, in the grander scheme of the world's history, really does not stand out except for what they've handed down to those of us around the world, which is their religion, this faith in Yahweh, the God who created all things, and a God who they would call their own, a God who had an interest in their nation, but one that we would all come to know as a God of all the nations. And so it's interesting that this measly little nation, in a crossroads where it was between three continents, you've got Northern Africa, Western Asia, and then Southern and Eastern Europe, that this population, being in such a war-battered area, would come to have such an influence on the world at large through their faith and through what Yahweh was doing with them by his faithfulness. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight, in particular the fact that the exile that they experienced, which might have meant the end of all things for them, was really the beginning of something very powerful. Let's talk about that exile and consider, first of all, what elements led to Judah's exile in the first place. You can approach it from a number of different angles, still talking about the same reality. You've got the rise of Babylon as a nation, as an empire, I should say, and they rose up from underneath the Assyrian power and then eventually overthrew them. And they expanded their empire, and they wanted to make sure that they had a firm foothold in that area of Canaan, also known as Palestine, where the people of Judah lived. Then you had the rebellion of two of Judah's kings, Jehoiakim, starting around 601 BC, and then later on, that rebellion by Zedekiah against the Babylonians. And by this second rebellion, the Babylonians, as you might imagine, had the last straw. And they figured that they would make an example out of this nation. The previous rebellion of Jehoiakim ended with the walls of Jerusalem being breached, but the city remained. It was not torn down, and the temple remained. But after that second rebellion, the whole city, together with the shrine of Yahweh, was destroyed. And a number of Jews, as you know, were exiled. And then, of course, coming as we do from that biblical perspective, these events are interpreted through Yahweh's own lens, by which he says that the reason for all these political events going on is ultimately due to the idolatry of Israel, breaking their covenant with Yahweh, in which Yahweh was supposed to be their only God, and furthermore, committing many acts of injustice, defrauding the poor, making sure that the hands that they lifted in praise at Yahweh's temple were actually covered in blood, metaphorically speaking, their fellow Judahites' blood. And so it had been a last straw for Yahweh as well in terms of all of these breaches of covenant. And so all of these are perspectives that you can take in determining why Judah went into exile. Now, how does the covenant pertain to this exile of Judah? How is that linked in, especially as regards Yahweh's purposes in exiling his people? And as you heard last week from my colleague and close brother, Charles Ricks, I'm sure he talked with you all about Torah, didn't he? And about how Torah, even though we might think of it as law, is so much more than that. Torah is God's instruction, and the terminology is linked very closely with the very core idea of covenant as well. It is instruction and it is law coming from God, but it is linked ultimately with God's relationship through covenant with his people, Judah. And Judah had continually broken this covenant with God, one by going after other gods, and then also by committing any number of acts that are against God's generous, loving character. And so for these reasons, as had been promised in the covenant kind of language, we see an example of this in Deuteronomy 27:28, if the people continued to rebel against God, they would be punished as per this agreement of the covenant. And one of the stipulations even mentioned within those chapters there is that one of the worst possible curses that people could bring upon themselves for infidelity was exile from the land that God had given them. And so that's what we have illustrated in this map here, in that red zone, if you can see it, is the course of their exile, at least a majority population of the people of Judah, into the regions of Mesopotamia, down to places like Babylon and Nippur. And this is a journey, in some cases, of roughly 1,000 miles. You might also think of it as backtracking from the route that Abraham, their forefather, took centuries before. Here's another map just to illustrate what that looks like. Jerusalem to Babylon. So these are the backdrops to this setting of the exile and why it happened. But as I said earlier, what we're interested in is that return from exile. So with that being said, what do we need to get this people back to their homeland and restored as a nation, and for that matter, with the confidence that they are still God's people, even though it seems for a time he has turned his face on them? One thing we're going to talk about is the need for reformed leadership. And such kings as Zedekiah, as you see them portrayed in some of the biblical literature like the book of Jeremiah, seem to have been very weak leaders, swayed by this or that political party, and not really having a clear vision led by God's own interests. Secondly, they need a revived identity. Try to put yourself in the shoes of these people of Judah who have lost their capital city, their king has been dethroned, the center of their government, and the very center sanctuary of their religion has been taken away. I was speaking to another group recently, and I likened it to, say, losing all the Bibles in the world, if you want to make a fair comparison. For Christians today, right, our religion is centered largely in the text. We live by that text, so we can meet any number of places in the world. But you're talking about a people who were less literate, most likely, than the average here in the States, and did not thrive as much on the text as they did in the experience of God's presence in his sanctuary in Jerusalem. So when they lose that, they lose the core of their religion. And so they need a revived identity, both politically, religiously, and in any number of other cultural manners. And then finally, they need a restored relationship with their God, a God who has punished them and whom they might feel to be very distant at this time, maybe even having given up on them. Let's talk about the leadership, first of all. The kingship has to be reformed, has to be revised within the context of Judah because of how badly things have gone. Jeremiah the prophet speaks to this. In Jeremiah chapter 30, he says, "In that day, declares Yahweh of hosts, I shall break his yoke from your neck and tear up its restraints, and foreigners shall no longer press them into service. But they shall serve Yahweh their God and David their king, whom I shall set up for them. As for you, Jacob my servant, do not fear, declares Yahweh, and do not be dismayed, Israel. I am going to rescue you from a distant place and your offspring from the land of their exile. Then Jacob shall return and enjoy quiet and comfort with no one to startle him." Very calming words, very reassuring by the end of this passage we've looked at here. But it's only following on the heels of a very tumultuous time when they have been under the yoke. The yoke here is the yoke of Babylon, symbolizing just as a farmer would put a yoke on his beasts of burden to make them pull the plow and so forth, that Israel has likewise been under the burden, under the leadership of a foreign power. And the language of David here is also symbolic. We're not talking about David himself, but really someone from his line. And this harkens back to some of that language I imagine you've studied in this summer series about God's covenant with David in particular, that he would always have someone to sit on the throne. He would have an eternal dynasty, in other words. Ezekiel, very similar to Jeremiah, has words likewise, both of critique of the kingship the way it's been, but also words of hope. "The word of Yahweh came to me, saying, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to those shepherds, this is what Lord Yahweh says. Woe to the shepherds of Israel who have been shepherding them. Should not shepherds tend the flock? Though you eat their fat, wear their wool, and slaughter the fatlings, you do not tend the flock." Keep in mind, in understanding this metaphor, it's okay for shepherds at this time, since they had to take the flocks far away from civilization, to reap some of the benefits of those flocks, including shearing, taking of their milk, and occasionally even slaughtering a sheep or a goat. But, again, the accusation here is that these metaphorical shepherds, these kings, have soaked up all the benefits of being king. You may remember Mel Brooks' famous line, right? It's good to be the king. But they've done nothing to really show compassion in their leadership for their people. But he goes on to say, "The weak you have not strengthened, the sick you have not healed, the fractured you have not bound up, those driven off you have not brought back, and the lost you have not gone seeking." There's that theme of injustice again that bothers Yahweh immensely. "You have ruled them with force and oppression. The flock became scattered for lack of a shepherd. They became food for all the wild animals and were scattered. My flock has gone astray on all the mountains and on every high hill. My flock is scattered over the entire face of the earth, and there is no one to seek them out or find them." Pause here for a moment, and let me ask you all, what is this language of scattering of sheep a metaphor for? Can you spot it? Yeah, they're that flock that's been scattered. So what is the scattering then? In this case, it's their exile. It's what they have undergone because of their own foolishness. But in this case, what Ezekiel is highlighting is the fact that these people, it's not to justify their actions, but a way of saying they have gone into exile in part because of what you kings have done, or what you have failed to do as kings. Again, Ezekiel, just like Jeremiah, prophets of this era used a lot of imagery like this, works in terms of these metaphors, criticizing these so-called shepherds, which are really the kings. He goes on, though, with a word of hope. He says, "Therefore, this is what Lord Yahweh says to them. I am here to judge between the fat and the lean members of the flock, because you push with your side and shoulder, and you thrust with your horns at the weak until you have scattered them away. I shall rescue my flock so that they are no longer plundered, and I shall judge between the members of the flock. I shall establish over them a single shepherd, that he may tend them, my servant David. It is he who shall tend them, and he who shall be their shepherd. I, Yahweh, shall be their God, and my servant David shall be leader among them. I, Yahweh, have spoken." Yahweh always seals the deal with his own name when he says those kind of words. I, Yahweh, have spoken. Notice here, Once again, very similar language, right? Just like we saw in Jeremiah, shepherds, and then that Davidic type language as well. Once again, David is not to be understood here as the literal David. By this point in time, David had long been gone, but that language of God putting David in control as shepherd over his sheep is a way of saying, I'm going to resurrect, in a manner of speaking, that Davidic line, that dynasty, and not only to reinstall a Davidic king, but also one who had a heart like David's. Somebody who would truly have concern for the people, who would be a leader that the people would want to follow. And this, it bears saying, is the very kind of language that really drives a lot of Jesus' own ministry in the regions of Galilee and Judea. When he talks with similar language about being the good shepherd, you may recall in John 10, or even some of his other parabolic language, like the shepherd going after the one lost sheep, right? This is pastoral language, which is not just pastoral. It's not just about imagery of sheep and how Jesus has this warm compassion for his people who seem like sheep without a shepherd. If you've picked up on the code and the way that it relates to Jeremiah and Ezekiel, this is actually regal kind of language as well. And so Jesus has that kind of a mentality of a good shepherd fulfilling these very kind of expectations that Yahweh put in the mind of a prophet like Ezekiel. And so you have to have this revision of kingship. You have to have a Davidic leader who truly acts like David did and brings back honor to that dynasty. But you also have to have some reform within the people. And hence we had that language in Ezekiel of God saying that he was going to judge also the members of that flock. Some of those sheep have gotten fat from elbowing the others out of the way so that they can get the best. And so this is speaking to the rich, the nobility, who were extorting and taking advantage of the poor. All right, so that's one of those elements we talked about, that kingship had to be revised within Israel if things were going to continue well after the exile. What they also needed was restored hopes as a nation. All right, what is their identity now that they have experienced such tragedy, losing homeland, central shrine, their political stability, all of that? And this breeds Ezekiel's vision, the very famous one, the Valley of Dry Bones. We have songs about it, right? We have lots of interesting pictures as well. I don't know if you can tell too well from where you are, but these are individuals with the sinews and the muscle structure all being sewn back together as per his words. Well, here are those words coming to us from Ezekiel 37. He says, "The hand of Yahweh was upon me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of Yahweh and set me down in the middle of the valley, which was full of bones. He made me walk about them. There were very many of them on the surface of the valley, and they were very dry. Then he said to me, 'Son of man, can these bones live?' I said, 'Lord Yahweh, it is you who knows.' Then he said to me, 'Prophesy over these bones and say to them, dry bones, hear Yahweh's word. This is what Lord Yahweh says to these bones. I'm about to put in you a spirit.'" And by the way, the term spirit here, or at least what I've translated as spirit, ruach in Hebrew, is a rather versatile word. It can mean spirit in some contexts. Otherwise, it can mean something like a wind or a breath. And for the ancient mindset, the distinction really didn't have to be made the way that you might say it does in English. But moving on, he says, "I will put in you a spirit that you might live." So I prophesied as I had been ordered, and there came a sound as I prophesied. There was a rumbling, and the bones joined one another. I looked, and there were sinews on them, and muscle grew up, and skin spread over them, but there was not any spirit in them. Then he said to me, "Prophesy to the spirit," and again, this could also be wind. "Prophesy, son of man, and say to the spirit, this is what Lord Yahweh says, come, spirit, from the four winds," also a word for spirit too, "and breathe on these slain that they may live." So I prophesied as I had been ordered, and the spirit entered them, and they came to life and stood on their feet as a very large army. Then he said to me, "Son of man, these bones are the entire house of Israel. They say, our bones are dry, and our hope is lost, and we are cut off." In fact, in English we have an idiom that sounds very much like this. We say we are dispirited, right? We are bereft of spirit. Therefore prophesy and say to them, this is what Lord Yahweh says, I'm about to open your tombs and bring you up out of your tombs, my people. I will bring you to the land of Israel. You will know that I am Yahweh when I open your tombs and bring you up from your tombs, my people. I will put my spirit in you that you may live. I will settle you upon your land, and you will know that I, Yahweh, have promised and fulfilled this, declares Yahweh. Powerful words to a people, as you might imagine, if you can put yourself in their shoes, who are feeling despondent at this time. In exile, having lost all connections with former homeland, and even in some cases with relatives, cut off from that kind of a lifestyle. Everything that defined them culturally, you might say. Holding on to only some remnants of what it is to be a Judahite, to be Jewish. And so this language that to us might sound very much like resurrection, a literal resurrection, which we're expecting in Christ, is actually itself also another one of those metaphors used by the prophets. In this case, this resurrection of these dry bones that you would never expect to come back to life, because not only are they dead carcasses, all the meat has dried off. How are you going to restore that to life? That's all a symbol for the people of Israel, or Judah more in particular. A way of saying, yes, you feel dead as a people group, as a nation, but God has it in his power to bring you back and restore you to nationhood, to restore you even to a relationship with him. And that brings us to our third and final point, that of the new covenant. You see, it's one thing to bring these people of Israel back to their homeland as God had promised, and that did happen in 539 BC under Cyrus the Great. But what's to prevent them from going into exile once again? Do you ever think about that one proviso, right? It's great, we're back in our homeland, but give it a few years, and the second honeymoon period starts to fade once again, and the Israelites might be just as likely to go back to their former ways. Jeremiah speaks to this, as does Ezekiel. Jeremiah says, days are about to come, declares Yahweh, when I shall make with the house of Israel and the house of Judah a new covenant. It shall not be like the first covenant that I made with their ancestors in the day I took them by the hand to take them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant that they themselves broke, though I was a husband to them, declares Yahweh. This is the covenant that I shall make with Israel after those days, declares Yahweh. So, buckle up. Here is the new covenant, the new terms. I shall put my law, and here's what you studied about last week, Torah, with all of its ethics, with all of its beauty of righteousness and God's standard of culture for his people. I shall put my law within them, and I will write it upon their heart, as opposed to stone tablets, right? I will write it on their heart. I shall be their God, and they shall be my people. They shall no longer teach each other, each one his neighbor, and each one his brother, saying, know Yahweh, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares Yahweh. For I shall forgive their evil, and their sin I shall no longer call to mind. That's the power of this idea post-exile of how the people of Israel would be restored and remain restored as God's people. This language that says, even though we had broken this old covenant, and because of that went into exile, yet because God is making a new covenant wherein he will this time put the law not on tablets of stone that Moses can break and what have you, but on our hearts where we can remember them and where it will be meaningful to us, and we will not be inclined to leave our God. And truly, many in my field, myself included, are convinced that it's really in this period of Babylonian exile that you see the first seeds of Judaism proper. That is to say, where to be a Jew is both to lay claim to your ethnic identity, but also to a religious identity. Prior to that exile, any number of Judahites might serve Yahweh, but any number of others were serving this or that deity. The problem was this broken fidelity with Yahweh in terms of his covenant. But in the midst of exile, as they start to weigh their tragedy and say, aside from cutting off our own lives, if we're going to press forward, then let's reevaluate. Let's think, how did we get here in the first place, and how can we rectify that? In the midst of exile, that's when they come to Yahweh. And Not to say that it's a perfect system. It's not as though overnight everybody who was a Jew was a fully fledged follower of Yahweh and immediately put away all their other gods. It was a growing period. But nonetheless, more solidified as a nation, they started to reflect on who they were when they're removed from homeland and from capital and from political safety and so forth. And they start to reevaluate themselves as Yahweh's people. Ezekiel, once again, Ezekiel and Jeremiah parallel each other a lot, and they're contemporary prophets. Ezekiel has similar wording. He says, "The word of Yahweh came to me, saying, Son of man, when the house of Israel was living in their land, they made it unclean by their way and their deeds. Like the uncleanness of menstruation, so was their way before me. So I poured out my wrath upon them because of the blood that they had shed on the land, and because of their idols with which they had polluted it. I scattered them among the nations, and they were dispersed among the lands. According to their way and their deeds, I judged them. And when they entered the nations to which they had come, they profaned my holy name, in that it was said of them, These are Yahweh's people, but they have gone away from his land. Then I had compassion on my holy name, the house of Israel had profaned among the nations they had entered." There's some irony, there's even a hint of humorous sarcasm, you might say, in these words. Notice how God is not saying, I had compassion on my people, my poor people who were scattered among the nations. He said, I had compassion on my name, which they had sullied by being put into exile in the first place. So there's a little bit of humor here on God's part, but it's a way of saying that the restoration of his people would not be anything attributable to them. It would be God's own hand at work in order ultimately to give glory to his own name. And if you think about it, how is it that the people of Israel had profaned Yahweh's name, especially in this context? Do you notice that wording? The explanation he gives is that they had profaned it not just in terms of the evil deeds they had done within the land when they lived in the promised land, but when they were exiled because of their rebellion to Yahweh. What does that look like if you're living in the ancient Near East? Except to say that it might look like Yahweh is a weak God compared to the other gods, especially if you're talking about the Babylonian gods who would be given credit by the Babylonians for giving them victory over Judah. And so in this way, Yahweh's name had been dragged through the mud, you might say, but he was going to vindicate his name, and there's that humor again, but the real meaning of that is he's going to save his people and work something in them that will make them different, will no longer result in them being exiled. And here's what that looks like in a later part of Ezekiel 36. Therefore, say to the house of Israel, this is what Lord Yahweh says. It is not for your sake that I am acting, O house of Israel, but for my holy name that you have profaned among the nations you have entered. I shall sanctify my name that is being profaned among the nations, because you have profaned it among them. The nations shall know that I am Yahweh, declares Yahweh, when I am sanctified through you before their eyes. I shall take you from the nations and gather you from all the lands, and I shall bring you to your own land. I shall sprinkle over you clean waters, and you shall be cleansed from all your uncleanness. From all your idols I shall cleanse you. Once again, no, we've got the same pattern that we learned about in Jeremiah. That is to say, God promises, one day I will bring you, my people, back to your land. So they had this hope through the prophetic voice saying, yes, one day, as bad as things are, we'll go back to our land. But again, that question that's burning in maybe some of their minds is, what's to prevent us from once again going into exile again? And so here's that reassuring word. He continues, I shall give you a new heart, and a new heart I shall put within you. I shall remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. Kind of makes me think of the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz, right? He wanted a heart. It is my spirit that I shall put within you, and I shall make it so that you walk in my decrees, and that you diligently practice my customs. You shall live in the land that I give to your ancestors, and shall be my people, and I shall be your God. Once again, powerful words coming to us from the voice of these prophets. Notice the similar language. Jeremiah talks about God putting his law, his Torah, you might say his custom into his people's hearts so that it's never removed from them. And Ezekiel, using very similar language, says that God will make a new heart for them. And for that matter, that he will even breathed his own Spirit into them. Let me just make this side comment as well. It bears saying, if the church is to get its mind strongly and confidently around the work of the Holy Spirit today in the church, here's where we begin. Passages like Ezekiel 36, which say to their original audience, guess what? You've messed up because your human spirits and your human hearts made you divert from my ways. So here's what's going to happen. And once again, it's very comical in Ezekiel's language if you think about the image. It's as if God is saying, you messed up, so I'm going to step inside of you and work the controls myself. I'm going to make you walk according to my ways and do the things that please me, and then the problem's solved. And it's very much a part of our theology of the cross, our theology of Christ's sacrifice, to also understand that when we are justified in Christ, we are also sanctified by that outpouring of his Spirit upon his people. We must make no mistake about that. If we leave out the Spirit's work, then we end up with this idea that Jesus just gives us a second chance. And if that's the case, that's no different from the first scenario that these Israelites are faced with. That is to say, if Jesus just purchases for us forgiveness of what we've done before, then what's to prevent us from going down those same pathways we've already gone that required that salvation in the first place? But just like the voice of the prophet, the Christian message is also God breathes his Spirit on his people and leads them to do the things that he desires. It's the fruit of the Spirit that is worked within us, but not by us. We're led by the Spirit within us. And we can claim none of our good deeds as our own. They are wrought in God. And for Christians, this is obviously a message that resonates with us because of the language of Jesus, talking about this is my blood of the new covenant, and as well as this language that is very pertinent to us about the outpouring of God's Spirit on his people. But some of this was already taking place, you might say, in the minds and the lives of these Judahites as they started to return to their land from their exile. And for many of them, it was like a new covenant, a new beginning. And it was a revolution, a revival of the old ways that they had forgotten, Yahweh's ways. It was a renewal and a reminder that they were Yahweh's people despite all of the tragedy that they had experienced in exile, and maybe even because of it. So again, what had Judah lost in exile? They lost their capital. They lost their central sanctuary. They lost their homeland and all the culture that gets tied with being in your homeland. But because of the experience of exile, they have to start redefining their identity by other means, things that they maybe cannot touch as easily. And that's why I say it's within exile that the idea of Judaism really has its earliest seeds, I would say. The term Jew, by the way, if you knew this or not, comes from the Hebrew term Yehudah, which is Judah. And yet, at this point in time when they were exiled, to be a person of Judah, to be a Judahite, did not necessarily mean that you were a follower of Yahweh until the nation as a whole reevaluates where they stand. And so you have this merging of an ethno-religious identity. To be Jewish speaks about your literal history in Abraham and the patriarchs, and it also speaks to your being a follower of Yahweh. And so Yahwism, the worship of Yahweh, gives way to Judaism, to where his people on a larger scale really are going to come to be defined as the people of Yahweh, and to be reminded that this covenant with Yahweh is very serious and has great demands upon their lives. Some Jews even remained outside of the Promised Land, even after given the opportunity to go back, and yet, even in those communities, it wasn't important that they were far away from the sanctuary, but if they had the scriptures and if they could meditate on what it is to be God's people, they were still Jewish. They were still Judahites in that sense. And so we as Christians can take a lot from that for ourselves today, being that it's no problem to us wherever we are. Is that the bell, by the way? Okay. Well, I'll wrap up soon. It doesn't matter to us as much where we are, where we worship God, and I think that's the case with the majority of Christians throughout the world. And yet, if you can try to sympathize with where these Jews were at that time and at that place, removed from not only their homeland, but what it meant for them originally to be a Jew, and how that redefined them, it can be a point of encouragement to us when we go through our own kinds of struggles. Maybe not in terms of an actual exile, but what about when we face these kinds of problems from outside the church, outside the ecclesia? Uncleanness, fear, confusion, destruction, new ideas that, as Ed himself was bringing up, you've been challenged this summer, haven't you? You've perhaps learned some new things about how God has worked through the history of the Bible and its compilation. And in many cultural contexts, those kinds of things, when they come at us from outside of our group and our societal structure, they can be threatening. But think about the way that Judaism was formed. When they faced uncleanness, fear, confusion, destruction through the exile, through their sufferings under the Babylonians, if anything, it defined them. It defined them as a people. And isn't that the case for Christians as well? Very famous painting, Agnus Dei, by Zurbaran. I imagine you can pick up very easily on what the imagery signifies, can't you? This is to signify Jesus as the Lamb of God. But it's a very gentle image, isn't it? As you might imagine, the crucifixion scene itself did not look like this. It probably looked more like Grunewald's depiction. A depiction of Jesus which is so famous because of how racked his body looks. He even has, if you look up closely at the painting, he has pox on his body. It looks diseased. The way that he depicts the wrists, they are truly writhing, almost as though just by his own exertion he might break these fragile bones in his body. This is truly a horrid depiction of Jesus' crucifixion, but it gets us back to that reality of what it is that saves us and what it is that defines us as a people that we commemorate every Sunday when we take the Lord's Supper. And so Christians themselves can say, in a manner of speaking, that we have been born out of exile, out of that exile that Christ himself experienced. And it can give us, by the way, encouragement for whatever sufferings we might go through in our own lives. Cancer, loss of job, loss of loved ones, you name it. I've only named a few. Can we examine those through the lens of the cross and say, just like the Jews, and just like the very birth of our religion, we can have a rebirth out of those moments of tragedy purely by the powerful workings of God in our lives. All right, thank you all, and I'm going to hand it back to Ed.